The reading today is from feminist and social critic Camille Paglia. She writes, "As an atheist, I have argued that if religion is erased, something must take its place. Belief systems are intrinsic to human intelligence and survival. They frame the flux of primary experience, which would otherwise flood the mind. But politics cannot fill that gap. Society, with which Marxism is obsessed, is only a fragment of the totality of life. As I have written, Marxism has no metaphysics. It cannot even detect, much less comprehend, the enormity of the universe and the operations of nature. Those who invest all of their spiritual energies in politics will reap the whirlwind. The evidence is all around us. The paroxysms of inchoate infantile rage suffered by those who have turned fallible politicians into saviors and devils, godlike avatars of good versus evil. My substitute for religion is art, which I have expanded to include all of popular culture. A society that respects neither religion nor art cannot be called a civilization." Well, our theme for December is mystery, the practice of embracing life with humility and awe. Last week, I considered humility and attempted to demonstrate that we darn well better be humble because it's so difficult to know anything. We casually throw around the word truth, but last Sunday I took a shot at demonstrating that it's tough even figuring out what that word means. I drew a distinction between facts, which are measurable, truths, which occur in social groups, and meaning, which is entirely subjective. I was reminded after assembly last Sunday that the motto for the CIA is the Bible verse that I was quoting last week, "And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Now, I suspect that many CIA operatives through the years have not reflected on the difference between truth and facts. Facts simply are. They are quantifiable anywhere, anytime, by anybody. Truth, on the other hand, is a social construct, a construct that can set some people free while it oppresses others. The truths that CIA operatives find are necessarily run through the baffles and the filters and maybe even the smoke and mirrors of patriotism and nationalism, which is not a bad thing in certain situations, but it is not a way of finding objectivity, if that's what you value. This week, I want to consider the awe part of this month's theme. First, it's good to remember that awe is an emotion, and therefore, like meaning, it is completely subjective. One person's awe is another person's ho-hum. Definitionally, awe is a reverential respect mixed with terror, dread, fear, wonder, big stuff like that. We can be awed by nature, a waterfall, a volcano, some grand sort of canyon. We can be awed by the forces of nature, thunderstorms, tornadoes, hurricanes. We can be awed by powerful people, such as monarchs and presidents, dread sovereign, or the dread pirate Roberts. Or by famous people like Lady Gaga. If she came in this morning, some of you would be filled with awe and gaga. By the way, next week I do intend to talk about art, both as a creative force and in viewing and experiencing art as a contributor to awe, but that's a whole different subject. We can be overawed by something. We just stop and freeze before some awesome power or personality. For many people, their concept of divinity creates awe. Both the concept of a deity that punishes and rewards, and that kind of deity that may be nature itself. Both can cause awe. It's even a title of an old gospel song that begins like this: "Our God is an awesome God. He reigns from heaven above with wisdom, power, and love. Our God is an awesome God." One thing I want to consider today is how each of us has a personal theology based on the many labels that we choose and that society chooses for us. And think about the personal and the subjective theologies that create the way we experience awe and create our worldview. And one way to think about this is to consider the way that Christianity took off in American soil. The Christian God brought to this hemisphere back in the 15 and 1600s was mighty and vengeful, a monarch. The great Puritan preacher Jonathan Edwards preached this, quote, "The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. Yea, there is nothing else that is given as a reason why you do not this very moment drop down into hell. O sinner, consider the fearful danger you are in." End quote. Now, that's the God I grew up with in a Pentecostal church. If you think Jonathan Edwards is correct there, and God holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some other loathsome insect over the fire, you're going to have this kind of awe and fear and dread in you when you think about it. Fact is, the fire and brimstone preachers achieve a sense of awe in their audiences. And evangelical movements continue today preaching that kind of God here and around the world. But for mainline Christianity, both Protestant and Roman Catholic, hellfire and brimstone have, for the most part, gone away. So, how do they produce awe now? Good question. Now, think about those immense cathedrals of Europe. They're mountains of stone and glass. They took entire cities, all of their resources, and generations to build those things. They soar hundreds of feet into the air, and there's incredible carving and art everywhere. The rich and the famous are buried down under the floor. There are commemorations of the powerful on the walls. And when you walk around in those things, you feel pretty small. But here in the U.S., well, we haven't done as well at that. We've got a basilica across the street over there. By medieval standards, it's not all that big, and it certainly isn't all that old. We have to admit that here in the U.S., even our great church buildings are kind of meh. Not much awe going on. Then consider the little white wooden boxes with steeples on top that dot the rural United States. They were lovingly built. A lot of them are taken care of meticulously even today. But they don't produce a whole lot of awe. Here in the United States, the awe of religion has never been about structures or the institutions of power or politics. The awe has been in the minds of people. It's been subjective. And sometimes that awe has been a fear of hell and death and violence. And sometimes it resides in an amazement at the natural world. Both awe, but very different where they're coming from. Now, how did that happen, that split? There's fascinating work going on nowadays in the field of religious studies in something that's being called the nice Jesus. The nice Jesus. Now, consider this. In those grand European cathedrals, Jesus is a monarch, He's truly a Lord in the old European way. When I think back to the beliefs of my parents and my grandparents, I think that the European model of monarch was their model for Jesus and God. They got on their knees in supplication. They begged the Lord for what they needed. Food, rain, health to work another day. And then that arbitrary and ununderstandable Lord would either grant their requests or not. And they never knew why. One of my grandmothers often quoted Matthew 6:34, her favorite verse, "Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof." And that's a kind of a dark vision. But that's how she experienced life. She had to make it through every day, and it wasn't all that easy. And the Lord handed out bounty or suffering, sometimes justly and sometimes arbitrarily, because that's how big, powerful monarchs are. They are awful. But my parents and grandparents were poor folk. Among the rising middle class in the late 19th century, in denominations here in the United States like the Congregationalists and the Episcopalians and the Unitarians and the Presbyterians and the Lutherans, there began to be this nice Jesus. Among Unitarians, Jesus became a really nice guy who had great ideas. For the Presbyterians, Jesus remained the Son of God, but he was still a nice guy. The best example of this is the paintings of the German Bernhard Plockhurst. All right? He's virtually unknown in Germany today. In Europe, the nice Jesus was another victim of the trench warfare of the First World War. In Europe, the implications of Darwinism sunk in, and theologians began to talk after the First World War about a metaphorical Jesus. And that's kind of where all liberal Christians are these days, because the nice Jesus movement died out, except here in the United States. So anyway, lithographs of Plockhurst's paintings are everywhere. The Plockhurst Jesus is Aryan with auburn hair. He always has a little glow around his head. One of his paintings is the Good Shepherd, showing Jesus with a shepherd's hook, looking kindly at a little lamb that he's carrying. Are you getting the picture? Another painting is Christ blessing the children, in which we see these blonde, middle-class children flocking to Jesus in his perfectly white robe. Plockhurst also painted guardian angels looking after children. And if you go on an antique store tour of the cities today, I bet you can find one. They were all over in Victorian-era America. You know what? The two little kids with the angel, and they're walking over this bridge that's about to fall in for some reason. Y'all, did your grandparents have, or parents have those? Yeah, see, yep. He's everywhere in 19th and early 20th century America. Probably in a great big heavy gold frame. The Plockhurst Jesus definitely had a good dental plan and a personal trainer, superb barber for that kind of beard, right? Immaculate. And he had a tailor for his bespoke robes, too, I don't doubt. The Plockhurst Jesus was solidly upper middle class, as were all the people around him. And that Jesus was a nice guy. The middle class and the aspiring middle class in the United States ate that stuff up. In mainline denominations, preachers stopped talking about hell and they started talking about love. But you see, there's a particular demographic that liked the nice Jesus. He's only nice for those for whom existence is nice. The upper crust had a nice Jesus. The rest of us, not so much. You see how the perceptions diverged over time. It was a race thing, it was a class thing, it was an urban and rural thing that started separating those two visions of Jesus. For the fortunate, Jesus is nice. And as the 20th century went along and the standard of living rose for many Americans, soon God became nice as well. We don't have to sacrifice and bow and scrape. God loves us and wants us to be happy. I don't think I have to think about it all that much. I don't have to go to church every Sunday. If I have a flat tire, all I got to do is pray and everything's going to be okay. Another aspect of the nice Jesus is that he wants his people to help the poor and the oppressed. That's where the social justice focus begins in mainline Christian churches. But for poor folks, a flat tire means your car is going to be sitting by the side of the road for a while. You might even get towed. Or you have to call your third cousin you really, really don't like. A loving God doesn't make sense to the oppressed. A mighty and awful God does make sense, but not that loving one. Evangelicals today may have a personal Jesus, and that's an invention of the 1960s, by the way, this personal Jesus idea on the right? They may have him as a Lord and Savior, but if they sin, he will slap you upside the head. So, there are at least two Jesuses walking around in America today. One will slap you upside the head if you get out of line, and the other one is a nice guy who will listen to your problems. If you get your awe from a compassionate and loving God, you want to spread the love and compassion around. And you see how the idea of a nice Jesus and a loving God feeds into political liberalism. It's partly about social class, it's partly about having a social safety net, it's partly about having an education. If you smack your kids around, I can tell you what kind of God you believe in. If you believe your kids are always right, I can tell you what kind of God you believe in. Now, humanism comes out of that nice Jesus movement, by the way. You have to, it has to be a kind of nice Jesus to stop believing entirely, right? So that's where how humanism gets out of the mainline place. So even as mainline Christianity has precipitously dropped in terms of numbers, trivia for the day, did you know that there are now more Wiccans in the United States than there are Presbyterians? Did you know that? So the number of mainline Christians has precipitously fallen over time, but even as that decline has occurred, they are still with us in nonprofits. I mean, we have a nonprofit for everything these days. The churches have kind of gotten out of that business a little bit, except for the downtown Congregations Against Homelessness, which is kind of a hybrid still in that kind of place between church and secular, right? But we have nonprofits everywhere, and that is the liberal, nice Jesus influence still alive today. And yes, I think that personal theology has a lot to do with political orientation. Humanism and free thought in its Unitarian form is a product of that nice Jesus. We're joined in this tradition by secular and liberal Jews who also got their ideas of love and compassion from the prophets like Micah that I talked about last week. What is required by your humanity but to do justice, love compassion, and walk humbly with your ideas. Now, I love the Spanish philosopher George Santayana and his take on lived experience. It's in your order of service this morning at the top. He says, I am not a spectator watching this cataract, but a part of the water precipitated over the edge. You are not an observer. You're right on the brink always. That's what Camille Paglia is getting at in the reading that I did this morning when she says, belief systems are intrinsic to human intelligence and survival. They frame the flux of primary experience which would otherwise flood the mind. Now notice that you've got Santayana with a cataract, big whirlpool here, right, going over, and you've got Paglia with a rush of water. It's all about getting flooded, right? That's what experience feels like. We need frames to work with in order to comprehend that rush of lived experience. And we need something in life to produce awe, because we need that. Which brings me to my final point. You may have read about the rat park experiments in the late 1970s. They're still being done today, trying to figure out if they're reproducible. The rat park experiments, and it began to get us to think a little bit differently about addiction. The received wisdom going into the rat park experiments was that rats would always get themselves addicted to opioids if they had the chance. You put rats in a cage with opioids and food, and the rats get addicted and eventually starve to death because they love the opioids so much. Now, in the rat park experiments, the researchers began with a question. What if it isn't the weakness of the rat, but the character of the cage? The experimenters put rats into big cages with companion rats and some access to sunshine and the outdoors and some toys to play with. In these changed circumstances, the rats did not get addicted to opioids and starve to death. And the difference, I would argue, is worldview. In one, the rat sees the world as a cruel cage. In the other, the rat sees the world as a playground. One has an awful, terrible God, and one has a loving one. Now, think about how you see the world personally. Is it a cage or a playground? Now, I was born into a family that definitely viewed the world as a cage. We were born into sin, and we did or did not save ourselves from eternal damnation by our actions in the world. We struggle to pay taxes and bills, and there's always, as that country song says, too much month at the end of the money. And sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. We were in a cage, and we believed in a powerful, awesome, awful God. Now, fortunately for me, I happened to be born in the United States when it was getting rich and powerful, and it was even the leakiest boats were getting up a little bit. So I got out of the cage. I got an education, etc. I was one lucky rat. I got to hang out with the nice Jesus. But remember that rock anthem from Smashing Pumpkins. Despite all my rage, I'm still just a rat in a cage. I think that summarizes the worldview of a lot of frightened, angry people. Fear and rage create your theology, right? And it also creates then your politics. It creates your worldview. It creates your life. The rapper Nas talks about getting out of that cage. He knows that there is a cage, but he also tells us that it's our attitude about being in the cage that will get us out of it or not. And Nas says, they home, doing nothing, might as well be in a cage, hating on young brothers, 1 foot in the grave. They used to love us till they found out we got through the maze.